October 23rd, 1944. The small village of Münchberg in northern Bavaria lay shrouded in early morning fog as Lieutenant Thomas Fletcher of the United States Army Air Forces was escorted through its cobblestone streets. With a hastily bandaged shoulder and exhaustion etched into his face, he struggled to keep pace with his German guards. Just 48 hours earlier, he had been piloting a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress over Frankfurt. Now he was just another captured airman headed for interrogation before being sent to a prisoner of war camp. "They say Americans drop bombs without caring what they hit," one of the guards remarked in accented English. "Let us see if you still believe in your mission after spending some time with us." Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What neither Lieutenant Fletcher nor his captors could possibly know was that the events about to unfold would not only challenge everything they believed about their enemies, but would ultimately create a legacy of reconciliation that would span continents and generations. The small medical facility where Fletcher was taken occupied what had once been the town hall. Like much of Germany in the final months of the war, resources were stretched beyond breaking point. The former administrative building now housed 30 beds for wounded soldiers, with another 12 spaces reserved for prisoners requiring treatment before transport to permanent camps. "Another one for you, Nurse Miller," announced Sergeant Weber as he pushed Fletcher through the doorway. "American pilot, shoulder wound, possibly some burns on his right arm. Needs to be fit enough for transport by the end of the week." Elizabeth Müller looked up from the bandages she was organizing. At 26 years old, she had already seen more suffering than most would witness in a lifetime. 3 years of nursing had transformed her from an idealistic young woman into someone who viewed bodies primarily as problems to be solved, but there was still a softness around her eyes that the war had not yet managed to extinguish. "Put him on bed 7, she said, her voice betraying neither warmth nor hostility. "I will examine him after I finish inventory." Fletcher studied the German nurse as the guard secured him to the bed frame with a length of chain that allowed limited movement but no possibility of escape. She was thin, like most Germans in 1944, but moved with purpose and efficiency. Her light brown hair was pulled back severely under her nurse's cap, and her plain face showed the strain of extended working hours and limited rations. "Fräulein," Fletcher said, as she approached his bed 30 minutes later, "I speak some German. My grandmother was from Hamburg." Elizabeth showed no reaction as she unwrapped the field dressing from his shoulder. "That will not be necessary, Lieutenant. My English is adequate." For 3 days, their interactions remained strictly professional. Elizabeth changed his bandages twice daily, administered medication for pain, and ensured he received the same meager rations as the German soldiers. Fletcher learned that she had trained as a nurse in Munich before the war and had been sent to Münchberg when the larger hospitals began transferring staff to smaller facilities throughout the country. On the 4th morning, everything changed. Fletcher woke to the sound of distant explosions. Allied bombing raids had intensified throughout Bavaria, targeting transportation networks and industrial centers. The small town of Münchberg was not a primary target, but its railway junction made it strategically significant. "Will they hit us?" asked a young German soldier in the next bed, his face pale with fear. He could not have been more than 18 years old. "They are precision bombers," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady as she continued changing bandages. "They target railways and factories, not hospitals." Fletcher caught her glance in his direction. "She is right," he said in German, addressing the frightened soldier. "American bombers have specific targets. They do not aim for medical facilities." The bombing continued for 20 minutes before moving eastward. When it ended, the hospital staff resumed their duties with the practiced calm of those who had become accustomed to living under the threat of aerial attack. But something had shifted in the dynamic between Elizabeth and the American prisoner. That evening, when she brought his medication, Fletcher noticed she lingered slightly longer than usual. "You have children?" he asked, nodding toward the small photograph she kept pinned inside her uniform. Elizabeth hesitated before responding. "My brother's children. Their mother was killed in Hamburg during the firebombing last year. He is fighting somewhere in Russia. We have not heard from him in 6 months. I am sorry, Fletcher said, the words feeling woefully inadequate. "This is war," she replied simply. "Everyone has lost someone." Over the next 2 weeks, their conversations gradually extended beyond medical necessities. Fletcher learned that Elizabeth came from a family of modest means. Her father had been a schoolteacher who died before the war, and her mother now lived alone in Munich. She had a sister who had married a factory manager and moved to Berlin. Elizabeth sent half her wages home each month to support her mother. Fletcher shared that he had grown up in Massachusetts, the son of a carpenter. He had been studying engineering when the war began and had enlisted in 1942. He had a younger brother also serving, though in the Pacific Theater. His mother wrote faithfully every week, though he had not received her letters since his capture. As his wounds healed, Fletcher became increasingly aware of his precarious situation. Healthy prisoners were quickly transferred to permanent camps, where conditions were reported to be harsh, particularly as Germany's resources dwindled. Food was increasingly scarce, and the winter of 1944 promised to be brutally cold, with fuel shortages throughout the country. "You will be transferred next week," Elizabeth informed him on a cold November morning. "Your shoulder has healed sufficiently for travel." Fletcher nodded, trying to mask his concern. Reports from other captured airmen suggested that the journey to permanent camps could be dangerous, with prisoners sometimes subjected to the anger of civilians who had lost homes and family members to Allied bombing. That evening, Elizabeth approached his bed after most of the ward had fallen asleep. "Lieutenant," she whispered, "there is something you should know. The train taking prisoners to the camp near Dresden was bombed yesterday. There were many casualties. The next transport will not be for at least 2 weeks." Fletcher understood what she was not saying. 2 more weeks in the medical facility meant better food, warmth, and far better treatment than he could expect at a prisoner of war camp. "Thank you," he said simply. "I am not doing this for you," she replied. "I do not believe keeping injured men in underheated cattle cars serves any medical purpose." By December, their relationship had evolved into something neither could have anticipated. Elizabeth began bringing extra bread from her own rations, slipping it to Fletcher when the guards were distracted. He, in turn, shared stories about his hometown, his studies, and his hopes for after the war. They were careful never to discuss military matters or anything that might be considered intelligence. "Why did you become a nurse?" Fletcher asked one evening as she checked his temperature. "I always wanted to help people," she said with a small, sad smile. "Now I wonder if I am truly helping anyone, or merely patching them up to suffer more." "You helped me," Fletcher said quietly. Elizabeth's eyes met his briefly before she turned away. "Sometimes I think this war will never end, that we will all grow old in this endless cycle of suffering." "It will end," Fletcher assured her, "and then we will all have to decide what kind of world we want to build from the ruins." As 1944 gave way to 1945, the situation in Germany grew increasingly desperate. Rations were cut again, and coal deliveries became erratic. The hospital was often so cold that patients could see their breath. Medical supplies dwindled to dangerously low levels, and Elizabeth worked 18-hour shifts as more of the staff were reassigned to field hospitals near the advancing front lines. Fletcher's official status remained recovering, though his wounds had healed completely. Dr. Hoffman, the elderly physician in charge of the facility, seemed to understand the unspoken arrangement and found reasons to keep the American prisoner under medical supervision. "The lieutenant's lung sounds are concerning," he would announce during rounds. "We must monitor him for another week." In January, disaster struck. A new military commander arrived in Münchberg, determined to enforce regulations to the letter. Captain Dieter Hoffmann ordered an immediate review of all prisoners being held in medical facilities. "This man is fully recovered," he declared upon examining Fletcher. "He will be transported to Stalag Luft 3 tomorrow morning." Elizabeth watched helplessly as the captain made his declaration. That evening, she found Fletcher sitting on the edge of his bed, his few possessions already packed into a small cloth bag. "I want to thank you," he began, but she cut him off with a gesture. "There might be a way," she said, her voice barely audible, "but it would be dangerous for both of us." That night, in the cramped office that served as Dr. Hoffman's consultation room, Elizabeth explained her idea to the physician. The elderly doctor listened without interruption, his lined face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "What you propose is against regulations," he said finally. "If discovered, you would certainly face severe consequences, possibly even charges of treason." "I understand," Elizabeth replied. "And yet," the doctor continued, "I have seen enough of war to know that sometimes humanity must transcend national borders." He sighed heavily. "I will help you, but you must understand the risks you are taking." The next morning, when Captain Hoffman arrived to oversee Fletcher's transfer, he was met by Dr. Hoffman in the hospital entrance. "I'm afraid there has been a development," the doctor announced. "The American pilot has contracted typhus. We have isolated him to prevent an outbreak." "Typhus?" the captain repeated skeptically. "Show me." In a small room that had been hastily converted into an isolation chamber, Fletcher lay on a narrow bed, his face covered with a rash created by Elizabeth using berry juice and makeup powder. His skin had been heated to simulate fever by applying hot compresses just before the captain's arrival. "As you can see, the infection is quite severe," Dr. Hoffman explained, as the captain peered through the doorway, careful to maintain his distance. "Highly contagious at this stage. We expect the critical period to last at least 3 weeks. The captain hesitated, clearly reluctant to challenge the medical assessment. "Very well," he said finally. "But I want daily reports on his condition, and the moment he is no longer contagious, I want to be notified immediately." For 3 weeks, Fletcher maintained the charade of illness, confined to the isolation room, where only Elizabeth and Dr. Hoffman would enter. As January turned to February, news reached Münchberg of the rapid Soviet advance from the east. The hospital received a growing number of frostbitten and shell-shocked soldiers retreating from the Eastern Front. "It cannot last much longer," Elizabeth told Fletcher during one of her visits. "Everyone knows the war is lost. It is only a question of how many more will die before the end." It was during this period of uncertainty and fear that Elizabeth revealed the full extent of her plan. "There is a way you might avoid being sent to a prison camp altogether," she explained, "but it would require a commitment that goes beyond the war." Fletcher listened as she outlined a possibility so unexpected that it momentarily left him speechless. According to regulations, prisoners who married German citizens could, under certain circumstances, be placed under house arrest in the custody of their spouse rather than being sent to camps. "You want us to marry?" Fletcher asked, stunned by the suggestion. "So it would be an arrangement of convenience only," Elizabeth clarified quickly. "A paper marriage to ensure your safety until the Allies arrive. Afterward, it could be annulled." "Would such a thing even be permitted?" "There are precedents," she explained. "Several French prisoners were allowed to marry German women earlier in the war. The local commander has discretion in such matters." "And you would do this for me? Risk your reputation, possibly worse?" Elizabeth's expression remained unreadable. "I have seen too much death," she said simply. "If I can prevent one more person from suffering, then perhaps that justifies the risk." What neither of them acknowledged was how their relationship had evolved from captor and prisoner to something far more complex. In the shared experience of survival amid deprivation and danger, they had discovered a connection that transcended national identities. The application process required Dr. Hoffman's assistance. As a respected member of the community, his endorsement carried significant weight. He presented the case to the local civil authorities, framing it as a love story that had blossomed despite the divisions of war. "Nurse Müller has demonstrated exemplary service to our wounded," the doctor testified. "Her dedication to duty is unquestionable. This unusual request should be viewed as a personal matter that in no way compromises her loyalty." To everyone's surprise, the marriage was approved in late February 1945. The district magistrate, perhaps recognizing that Germany's defeat was inevitable, seemed almost relieved to authorize an act of humanity amid the surrounding devastation. The ceremony took place in the hospital chapel on March 3, 1945. It was brief and austere. Elizabeth wore her nurse's uniform with a small white flower pinned to her collar. Fletcher was permitted civilian clothes borrowed from Dr. Hoffman's son. The witnesses consisted of the doctor, 2 elderly nurses, and a German lieutenant recovering from wounds who had become friendly with Fletcher during his convalescence. "I, Thomas Fletcher, take thee, Elizabeth Müller, to be my lawful wedded wife," he recited in careful German, the words feeling surreal as they left his lips. "I, Elizabeth Müller, take thee, Thomas Fletcher, to be my lawful wedded husband," she responded in English, her accent making the familiar words sound foreign and strange. The magistrate pronounced them husband and wife, with the brusque efficiency of a man with many more pressing concerns. There was no celebration afterward, only a return to the hospital where Elizabeth resumed her duties, and Fletcher was assigned to a small room that had previously served as a storage closet. Under the terms of the arrangement, Fletcher remained technically a prisoner, but was placed in Elizabeth's custody. He was required to report daily to the local police station and was forbidden from traveling beyond the town limits. In practice, this meant he now assisted at the hospital, initially performing basic maintenance tasks and eventually helping with patient care as the staffing situation grew increasingly desperate. As the Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany from both west and east, the flow of wounded into Münchberg increased dramatically. Fletcher found himself working alongside Elizabeth for 18 hours at a stretch, holding pressure on wounds, changing bandages, and comforting the dying. The distinction between enemy and ally became meaningless in the face of such suffering. "They are so young," Fletcher remarked one night as they took a brief rest, sharing a cup of weak ersatz coffee. Most of them barely old enough to shave. "The younger they are, the more they believe in final victory," Elizabeth replied wearily. "It is the older ones who understand what is happening." On April 14, 1945, American forces reached the outskirts of Münchberg. The remaining German military personnel retreated eastward, leaving the town essentially undefended. Dr. Hoffman raised a white flag over the hospital, and Fletcher walked out to meet the advancing American troops. "Lieutenant Thomas Fletcher, United States Army Air Forces," he announced to the astonished sergeant leading the patrol. "Serial number 0857239. I was shot down in October last year." Within hours, Fletcher found himself explaining his extraordinary situation to a bemused American major. "She's my wife," he stated simply when asked about Elizabeth. "I want her placed under my protection." The weeks that followed were chaotic, as occupation forces established control and began processing displaced persons, former prisoners, and German civilians. Fletcher, now reintegrated into the American military, used his position to ensure that Elizabeth and the hospital staff were treated with respect and provided with additional supplies. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked one evening as they sat in the small room they had come to share. "You will return to America soon." "We both will," Fletcher replied, "if you're willing." Elizabeth looked at him in surprise. "You cannot be serious. The marriage was an arrangement, a way to survive the war. Surely you do not feel obligated to maintain it." "This is not about obligation," Fletcher said quietly. "These past months, working together, facing death together, I've come to know you in ways that would have been impossible in peacetime. I don't want that to end." "Your family would never accept a German wife," Elizabeth protested. "Especially not now with all the stories coming out about what my country has done. They will accept the woman who saved my life and showed courage when it mattered most," Fletcher insisted. "The rest we will face together." The process of securing permission for Elizabeth to travel to America as a war bride was complicated by the chaotic conditions of post-war Germany. Fletcher was repatriated in June 1945, but refused to leave without her. He extended his service commitment to remain in the European theatre and worked tirelessly through military and civilian channels to arrange her paperwork. Finally, in September 1945, they boarded a transport ship in Bremerhaven, bound for New York. Elizabeth carried a single suitcase containing her few remaining possessions, including the photograph of her nephew and niece and letters from her mother, who had survived the war in Munich. The journey across the Atlantic gave them time to contemplate the uncertain future awaiting them. "What will we do in America?" Elizabeth asked, as they stood at the rail, watching the coastline of Europe recede into the distance. "I'll complete my engineering degree under the GI Bill," Fletcher replied, "and you can continue nursing if you want, or study something new. The important thing is we'll have choices that weren't possible before." As the ship approached New York Harbor, Elizabeth caught her first glimpse of the Statue of Liberty emerging from the early morning mist. "It is smaller than I imagined," she observed. Fletcher smiled. "Many things in America might be different from what you imagine. Some better, some worse. We'll discover them together." The reception in Massachusetts was initially as awkward as Elizabeth had feared. Fletcher's mother, though unfailingly polite, clearly struggled to reconcile her joy at her son's safe return with the presence of his German wife. Fletcher's younger brother, recently returned from the Pacific with a pronounced hatred for all enemy nations, was openly hostile. "You have to understand," Fletcher explained to Elizabeth after a particularly tense family dinner. "James lost his best friend at Okinawa. He's still fighting the war in his mind." "I understand better than you think," Elizabeth replied softly. "We are all carrying ghosts from this war." What began to change the family dynamic were the practical realities of daily life. When Fletcher's mother fell ill with pneumonia that winter, it was Elizabeth who nursed her back to health, applying skills honed in far more desperate conditions. When James struggled with nightmares and what would later be recognized as combat stress, Elizabeth's quiet understanding and professional knowledge provided more comfort than the well-meaning but ineffective advice of civilian friends. By the spring of 1946, Fletcher had enrolled at Massachusetts Institute of Technology to complete his engineering degree. Elizabeth, after passing equivalency examinations, secured a position at the local hospital. Their life together began to establish a routine that might have seemed ordinary to outside observers, but represented a daily victory over the divisions that had brought their nations to war. It was at this point that Fletcher made the decision that would eventually astonish everyone who knew their story. Using his veteran's benefits and a small inheritance from his father, he purchased a plot of land outside Boston and began designing a house. "It will have a large kitchen for your German cooking," he told Elizabeth as they reviewed the plans, "and a room that can be converted to a nursery when the time is right." Elizabeth traced the drawings with her finger. "You are building for a future we cannot see." "I'm building on what I already know," Fletcher replied. "That if we could find each other amid the worst that humanity can create, we can certainly build something good in peacetime." In June 1947, their daughter Catherine was born. Elizabeth's mother traveled from Germany for the birth, the journey made possible by Fletcher's careful arrangements and persistent navigation of occupation regulations. The meeting between Fletcher's mother and Elizabeth's represented a small but significant reconciliation between families divided by war. As the years passed, Fletcher's engineering career flourished, eventually leading to his founding a company specializing in structural restoration. The skills he had learned rebuilding war-damaged buildings in Germany, he now applied to historic preservation in New England. What truly astonished their friends and family, however, was the project Fletcher undertook in 1955. Using contacts he had maintained with Dr. Hoffman and others in Münchberg, he established a scholarship fund for German nursing students to study in American hospitals. The Thomas and Elizabeth Fletcher International Nursing Exchange was formally inaugurated with a ceremony at Massachusetts General Hospital. Elizabeth, now an American citizen but still speaking with the accent of her homeland, addressed the gathering. 10 years ago, our nations were enemies, she said. Today, we recognize that medicine and healing transcend national boundaries. The knowledge and skills that save lives belong to all humanity. The first recipients of the fellowship included Elizabeth's niece, Hannah, who had survived the war in foster care after her mother's death. She arrived in Boston as a shy 20-year-old and completed her nursing training under Elizabeth's mentorship before returning to Germany to establish similar exchange programs. By 1960, the Fletcher program had expanded to include nurses from Japan, Italy, and other former Axis nations. What had begun as one man's tribute to the woman who had saved his life had evolved into an international network dedicated to healing and reconciliation. When interviewed for a magazine article about the program, Fletcher was asked what had motivated him to create such an extensive project. His answer was characteristically straightforward. "During the war, I learned that humanity can survive under the most inhumane conditions if we recognize ourselves in others," he said. Elizabeth taught me that courage doesn't always wear a uniform, and that sometimes the bravest acts are the quiet daily decisions to choose compassion over hatred. Elizabeth, standing beside him, added her perspective. What we are doing is not extraordinary. We are simply acknowledging that the divisions created by war are artificial. The need for healing is universal. Their story might have remained a private family narrative, but for a chance encounter in 1962. A journalist researching a book about unusual wartime experiences heard about the American pilot who had married his German nurse and built an international medical exchange in her honor. The resulting book, Healing Across Enemy Lines, The Fletcher Story, became an unexpected bestseller, particularly in Germany, where it was translated under the title Die Brücke der Versöhnung, The Bridge of Reconciliation. By the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II in 1995, the Fletcher Foundation had sponsored exchanges for more than 2,000 nurses from 27 countries. Thomas and Elizabeth, now in their 70s, were invited to ceremonies in both Washington and Berlin, commemorating the war's end. In Münchberg, the small hospital where they had met was now a modern medical center with a wing dedicated to international education. A plaque in the entrance hall bore their names and a simple inscription. From the darkest moments of human conflict came a light of understanding that continues to illuminate the path toward peace. When asked by a young German reporter what message they wished to convey to future generations, Elizabeth replied with the wisdom of one who had witnessed both the worst and best of humanity. "Never allow ideology to blind you to the individual human being standing before you," she said. "In the end, we are all seeking the same fundamental things: safety, purpose, connection. If Thomas and I found these things across the divisions of war, imagine what is possible in times of peace." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.